Okay. Hi Tom. How's everything going? Yeah? Good? That's good to hear. Okay. Are you ready for today's lesson? Okay. So today we'll be talking about the menstrual cycle. So first of all, how much do you know about the menstrual cycle, Tom? Not much? That's fine. I hope by the end of today's lesson, you'll have a better understanding of the menstrual cycle. So here is an overview of the concepts that we'll be talking about today. So I'm going to first give an introduction to the menstrual cycle, and then I'll talk about some of the organs and structures that are involved. And then I'm going to talk about the detailed mechanisms of how the menstrual cycle work and the interaction of different hormones. Finally, I'm going to ask you to give me a recap of all the things that we've talked about today based on a diagram that I'm going to give you. Okay, so first of all, what is the menstrual cycle? Here is a definition that I found online. Is it okay if you read it for me? Yep. So the two main things that you have to know about the menstrual cycle is that first, it is a complex series of hormonal and physiological changes. And second, the main role of the menstrual cycle is that it prepares a woman's body for possible pregnancy. A typical menstrual cycle lasts around 28 days, so roughly a month, and there are four main phases. The menstrual phase, the follicular phase, which overlaps with the menstrual phase, and then ovulation phase, and then finally luteal phase. It's okay if these terms sound a bit unfamiliar to you. By the end of the day's lesson, you're gonna know more about these phases. So here are the organs that are involved in the menstrual cycle. I've separated them into two main categories. So they're the structures in the brain and then the reproductive organs. So the two main structures in the brain that you have to know are the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Both of these structures are involved in the secretion of hormones. And then the reproductive organs. The two main reproductive organs involved are the ovaries and the uterus. Last session, we've talked about the role of different reproductive organs. So Tom, can you tell me what is the main function of the ovaries? Yep, that is correct. So the ovary is involved in the production of a mature egg. And what about the uterus? Exactly. The uterus supports for a fertilized egg and pregnancy. Okay, now we're going to move on to the more complicated part of this lesson, which is the mechanisms of the menstrual cycle. So for simpler understanding, I'm going to draw out some of the concepts so it's easier for you to visualize as well. Okay, so I'm going to start with the follicular phase. The reason why I'm starting with follicular phase instead of the menstrual phase is because I think it's more intuitive, and also because these two phases overlap with each other anyways. Okay, so last slide we've talked about the two main structures in the brain. Can you tell me what the structures are? Yep, so first of all we have the hypothalamus, and then right beneath it we have the two pituitary glands. And in today's lesson we'll be mostly concerned about the anterior pituitary gland. So the beginning of puberty, or at the beginning of each menstrual cycle, the hypothalamus is going to start producing increasing levels of an hormone called GnRH, which stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then this hormone is going to act directly on the anterior pituitary gland and causing it to produce two other hormones, the follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Don't worry, I wrote all of these terms down in the slides, so if you want to refer back to it, you can always just look at the slides. So these two hormones are going to be secreted into the bloodstream. They're going to travel down the bloodstream and then target on the ovaries. So, as we've talked about, the ovaries are mainly involved in the production of a mature egg. So it's going to contain a lot of follicles, primarily primordial follicles and primary follicles. The FSH, as the name suggests, follicular stimulating hormone, it's going to act directly on these follicles and cause them to mature. At the beginning of the follicular phase, the FSH is going to cause the growth of multiple ovarian follicles at the same time, and each of these follicles is going to contain an egg. But as the follicular phase progresses, one prominent follicle is going to be selected, so that with each menstrual cycle, only one follicle is going to be produced. Okay, now I'm going to draw a simple diagram of how a follicle looks. So here is a follicle. In the middle, we're going to have an egg, which is also called an oocyte. And around it, we're going to have a lot of granulosa cells, which are cells that kind of support the oocyte. And the FSH receptors are going to be located on these granulosa cells. Therefore, the larger an ovarian follicle is, and the more granulosa cells it has, the more FSH receptors there are going to be on this follicle. So here is a larger follicle with a lot of granulosa cells, and it's going to have a lot more FSH receptors. Therefore, it's going to respond to FSH a lot better than a small follicle. Okay, so as these follicles mature, they're also going to begin producing increasing levels of estrogen. So what is estrogen? Estrogen is basically another hormone, and one of its main functions is that it's going to inhibit the production of FSH from the pituitary gland. So it's going to inhibit FSH production. Therefore, as more follicles mature and produce increasing levels of estrogen, the levels of FSH will also decrease, and this leaves only the biggest follicles with the most receptors able to continue to grow in response to the FSH levels. Therefore, by the end of the follicular phase, only one mature secondary follicle will be produced. So this is the selection mechanism of the menstrual cycle, so that with each menstrual cycle, only one follicle is going to be produced. Okay, so we've talked about the effect of estrogen on FSH, and what about its effect on LH? We haven't really talked about LH that much in follicular phase because it really doesn't play that big of a role in the follicular phase. And the effect of estrogen on LH is also a bit more complex than its effect on FSH. So at low concentration of estrogen, it's going to have an inhibitory effect on LH. So it's going to keep LH at a relatively low level. However, at higher concentration of estrogen, its effect on LH is going to reverse. Therefore, it's going to stimulate the secretion of LH. Okay, so these are the main events that happen in follicular phase. Do you have any questions? No? Okay, then I'm going to ask you to tell me about how the levels of different hormones change during the follicular phase. And I'm going to draw it out on this diagram, so it's going to be easier to visualize. So we've talked about LH. We're going to start with LH. How do you think LH is going to change throughout the follicular phase? Yep, it's going to remain at relatively low levels throughout the follicular phase because increasing estrogen level is going to keep it at a fairly low level. And what about FSH? Not quite. So at the beginning, FSH is going to increase, indeed. However, as the follicle grows throughout the follicular phase, it's going to inhibit the secretion of FSH. Therefore, there's going to be a slight decrease towards the late follicular phase. Does that make sense? Yep, that's good. Okay, and what about estrogen? Yep, nice and simple. Estrogen is going to increase continuously throughout follicular phase. And what about progesterone? We haven't really talked about progesterone, but in follicular phase, it's just going to stay nice and low. Okay, does everything make sense? That's good. Now we're going to move on to ovulation phase. So at the end of follicular phase, remember, we left off with increasing level of estrogen. So estrogen is going to be at a fairly high level. And as we've talked about, high levels of estrogen is going to cause increasing levels of LH. Therefore, at the end of the follicular phase, there is going to be a surge of luteinizing hormone. And this is going to be what signals for ovulation. So surge in LH, it's going to cause ovulation. What exactly is ovulation? So remember, here we have our secondary follicle with the oocyte in the middle and then the granulosa cells, right? And with the surge in LH, it's going to push the oocyte out of the granulosa cells, and the remaining granulosa cells are going to be called the corpus luteum. Yep, that is basically what happens in ovulation. Yep. Did you just ask what happens to the egg? Yep. So basically, after this egg gets released, it's going to travel down the fallopian tube, and that's when it's going to wait for a potential fertilization. And if it's not fertilized, then it's just going to die and shed away with the endometrium at the end of the menstrual cycle. Okay. So, based on this information, could you tell me how these hormonal levels might change? So let's start with LH. Yep. So because of estrogen, there is going to be a dramatic surge in LH. Oops, that's a bit too slow. So there's going to be a dramatic surge in LH. What about FSH? Yep, I haven't really talked about FSH, but increasing levels of estrogen is also going to cause a smaller surge in FSH. What about estrogen? So estrogen, during ovulation, is going to experience a significant drop. And progesterone, we also really haven't talked about it much, but it's just going to slowly increase and slowly increase until ovulation. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about the luteal phase. So by the end of ovulation, remember, we were left with a corpus luteum. So what does the corpus luteum do? It basically secretes more hormones. Quite a lot of hormones, right? The corpus luteum basically secretes 3 different types of hormones. It's going to secrete, first of all, estrogen, again. Second of all, progesterone. Yep, this is where progesterone finally comes into play. And then it's also going to secrete another hormone called inhibin. And although there are 3 different hormones, the 2 main effects that the corpus luteum cause are basically, first of all, it's going to cause the growth and maintain the endometrium. Growth and maintain the endometrium. Can you tell me what the endometrium is, Tom? Yep, basically the endometrium is the most inner layer of the uterus, and it's going to be where a fertilized egg lands and implants. Okay, so that's the first role. And second of all, another function of the corpus luteum is that it's going to inhibit GnRH and subsequently inhibit FSH and LH, so that there will no longer be more follicles, more follicular growth during the luteal phase. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the different roles of these 3 hormones. So estrogen, as we've talked about, it basically inhibits the level of FSH, and it also supports the growth of the endometrium. Progesterone, it also does both of these jobs, so growth and maintain the endometrium, and then it also growth and maintenance of the endometrium, and it also inhibits the levels of GnRH. And inhibin, as the name suggests, only inhibits these hormones. However, throughout the luteal phase, the corpus luteum is going to slowly degenerate. It's going to slowly become smaller and eventually die. It's going to die like this. And as you can imagine, as the corpus luteum slowly dies, the levels of these 3 hormones are going to slowly decrease. And based on what I just talked about, Tom, can you tell me what are the potential consequences of the degeneration of the corpus luteum? Yeah, so first of all, the endometrium will no longer be maintained, and it's going to slow away, and that's going to cause bleeding, and that's going to end up becoming what we call the period. So endometrium shed. And the second effect is that because inhibin, progesterone, and estrogen levels will decrease, so it's going to lift the inhibitory effect on GnRH. Therefore, the levels of GnRH is going to slowly increase again, and that's going to cause slow increase in the levels of FSH and LH, and that's going to cause the growth of follicles. Does that sound familiar? Yep, so that's basically going to start another round of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so GnRH increase, and then another round of the cycle. Okay, so that's basically all the events that will happen in a menstrual cycle. Okay, now can you tell me how the levels of hormones might change? So let's start with luteinizing hormone. Yep, so because of the high levels of estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin, LH will be suppressed to a fairly low level throughout the luteal phase until the second half of luteal phase, when estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin levels slowly decrease, and LH level is going to slowly rise again. And what about FSH? Yep, it's basically going to experience a similar effect. estrogen. Yep. So at the beginning of luteal phase, estrogen is going to rise due to corpus luteum. However, as corpus luteum degenerates, the level of estrogen is going to decrease as well. And then what about progesterone? Yep, basically the same as estrogen. Perfect. So that's pretty much all the events in the menstrual cycle. Do you have any questions? No? Okay. Now we're going to move on to a recap, and I'm going to ask you to explain to me the whole process of menstrual cycle based on this diagram. Okay. Yep. Yep. Yep, that's all correct. So, do you have any other questions? If not, that's going to be everything for today. And I know this is a fairly complex topic, so if you have any questions, you can always ask me. And I also recommend you to go through this topic a few more times on your own so that you don't forget it. Yeah. All right, I'll see you next lesson.